On Monday, June 22nd of this year, President Trump stood in the Oval Office and signed two executive orders specifically designed to make sure the United States stays ahead of China in quantum computing, one of the most strategically significant technology races of this entire decade. 48 hours later, at a conference Etage in Hamburg, Germany, Chinese officials walked up to accept an award for building the single fastest supercomputer on the entire planet, dethroning a machine the American government itself uses to help maintain its own nuclear weapons stockpile. The timing here is almost too perfectly ironic to be real, and if you only read the headlines, you would be forgiven for assuming America's quantum ambitions had just been humiliated within days of being announced. But the actual complete story underneath that dramatic timing is considerably more nuanced, considerably more interesting, and honestly, considerably more revealing about how this entire technology race genuinely works than the simple headline version suggests. So let's walk through exactly what happened on both sides of this story, what China's supercomputer victory actually does and does not prove, and why the specific timing, coincidental as it might genuinely be, still tells you something meaningful about where this broader competition currently stands. Let's start with Trump's executive orders themselves, because understanding exactly what they actually contain matters enormously for correctly evaluating everything that happened afterward. The first order, formally titled Ushering in the Next Frontier of Quantum Innovation, launches what the administration calls a national effort specifically aimed at building a genuinely powerful quantum computer, one capable of what the order describes as initiating the era of quantum-enabled scientific discovery. Practically speaking, this order establishes something called the Quantum Computer for Application Development and Discovery Science Effort, coordinated by the President's own Science and Technology Advisor, tasking the Department of Energy with exploring private sector partnership models and directing the Department of Commerce to develop a plan, potentially including advanced market commitments, specifically to encourage commercial quantum computing companies to actually contribute toward building this ambitious national research machine. Michael Kratsios, the director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, stated publicly during a call previewing the announcement that the administration believes this specific quantum computer could become reality by 2028, a genuinely ambitious, specific timeline for a machine the order itself acknowledges does not yet exist anywhere in a fully realized, scientifically useful form. The second order, titled Securing the Nation Against Advanced Cryptographic Attacks, addresses a threat we have actually discussed in considerable depth in previous videos on this channel, the danger that a sufficiently powerful quantum computer could eventually break the encryption currently protecting the vast majority of digital information and communication around the world. This specific order formally establishes a goal of migrating key government computing systems toward post-quantum cryptography, the new generation of quantum-resistant encryption methods we also covered in detail in an earlier video, by 2030 or 2031, and it goes further than simply setting a soft aspirational target. By December 31st of 2030, the order specifically requires that all federal contractors covered under the Federal Acquisition Regulation become fully compliant with these new post-quantum cryptography standards, effectively using the enormous leverage of federal government contracting requirements to compel private companies doing business with Washington to adopt these new security standards on a legally binding, enforceable timeline, rather than simply encouraging voluntary adoption, at whatever pace individual companies happen to find convenient. It is genuinely worth noting, before we move forward, that this was not the very first time the Trump administration had signaled serious, sustained interest in quantum computing, specifically as a strategic priority. According to the White House's own public statements accompanying this announcement, President Trump had already, back in January of 2025, established the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, specifically to help spearhead American competitiveness across several emerging technology fields, and separately, in November of 2025, signed an earlier executive order launching something called the Genesis Mission, a broader national initiative specifically focused on using artificial intelligence to accelerate scientific research and discovery across multiple fields, quantum computing very much included among them. The administration also pointed out that federal research and development funding specifically dedicated to quantum computing had already doubled under this same administration prior to this most recent June announcement, suggesting these two newest executive orders represent more of an escalation and formalization of an already established multi-year policy priority, rather than a sudden The active first step taken in response to any single specific competitive threat or headline event. Energy Secretary Chris Wright, speaking directly at the signing ceremony itself, offered a genuinely candid, refreshingly honest assessment of exactly where American quantum computing capability currently stands, describing quantum computing as poised to become the third pillar supporting the future of computing technology overall. joining artificial intelligence and advanced semiconductor manufacturing as the foundational technologies underpinning the coming decades of scientific and economic progress. But he was notably careful not to oversell where things currently stand, stating plainly, in his own words, that achieving genuinely scientifically relevant, meaning properly error-corrected, quantum computing remains tricky, adding that the country is close but not there yet, while expressing confidence that this specific administration's coordinated policy effort would successfully deliver that capability before its own term concludes. IBM's chief executive Arvind Krishna, notably present at the signing ceremony itself, publicly applauded both orders, specifically praising what he described as the alignment of sound policy, sustained investment, and public-private partnership working together in lockstep at the national level, a statement worth remembering given everything we discussed in a previous video regarding IBM's own genuinely enormous, recently announced investment in dedicated domestic quantum chip manufacturing infrastructure. Now let's turn to what actually happened just 2 days later, because this is where the story takes its genuinely striking, almost cinematically ironic turn. On June 23rd, at the International Supercomputing Conference held in Hamburg, Germany, officials announced the newest edition of the Top 500 list, the biannual, globally recognized ranking of the world's most powerful classical supercomputers, and sitting at the very top of that list for the first time in 3 years was a Chinese-built machine called Linshine, developed and operated by the National Supercomputing Center in Shenzhen. This system reportedly achieved computational performance of nearly 2.2 quintillion calculations per second, outperforming the previous title holder, a machine called El Capitan, by more than 20% on the key benchmark test used to rank these systems. And El Capitan is not simply some anonymous, abstract piece of American computing infrastructure. It is housed at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and the United States government specifically relies on that exact machine to help develop and maintain the safety and reliability of its own nuclear weapons stockpile, precisely the kind of maximally sensitive, maximally strategic computing infrastructure any country would want to keep firmly ahead on. Before we go any further, though, it is genuinely important to address something directly, because the title of this specific video does something that a fully careful, fully honest analysis needs to correct clearly right up front. Linshine is a classical supercomputer, built using traditional, if extremely advanced, computer chip architecture, running the same fundamental type of computation that classical computers have always performed, simply at an extraordinarily faster scale and with far greater raw computational power than any previous machine had managed before it. It is not, in any meaningful technical sense, a quantum computer, and it does not use quantum bits, superposition, or entanglement, the specific underlying physical properties that define genuine quantum computing technology. The exact category of machine both of Trump's June 22nd executive orders were actually specifically focused on, framing this story as China literally beating America specifically at quantum computing immediately following a quantum-focused executive order, conflates two genuinely separate, if related, technological competitions, classical supercomputing on one side and quantum computing on the other, in a way that, while certainly attention-grabbing, is not actually technically accurate. The honest, more precise version of this story is that China achieved a genuinely significant classical supercomputing milestone within days of an American presidential announcement specifically focused on a different, though closely related, emerging computing technology and the coincidental timing between those two separate events. While genuinely striking and worth examining, does not mean China literally answered or directly rebutted Trump's specific quantum computing initiative with this particular achievement. With that important clarification made, let's dig into why this classical supercomputing achievement is still genuinely significant, and why the broader strategic context surrounding it connects meaningfully back to the exact same underlying technology competition we have discussed extensively across previous videos on this channel. China had not actually claimed the top spot on the top 500 list since 2017 and had stopped submitting its most powerful systems for consideration entirely since 2023, deliberate absence that experts widely attributed at the time to the country, grappling with increasingly severe chip-related export controls imposed initially under the Biden administration and largely continued since. That 3-year absence from the world's most prestigious public supercomputing ranking makes Linshine's sudden return to the very top spot genuinely noteworthy, not simply as a raw performance achievement, but as a deliberate, calculated public statement about China's own domestic technological self-sufficiency. According to reporting on the system's technical specifications, Linshine uses entirely domestically designed chips, built without relying on the most advanced foreign semiconductor, manufacturing technology that remains subject to ongoing American export restrictions, precisely the kind of technological independence China's broader national strategy, which we have discussed in earlier videos covering its 5-year plan and its various quantum computing initiatives, has been deliberately working toward across nearly every category of advanced computing technology simultaneously. If you find this kind of careful, nuanced look at how these dramatic-sounding technology headlines actually hold up under closer scrutiny genuinely valuable, go ahead and hit that like button right now. It really does help this channel reach more people who want the complete, honest picture rather than just the more sensationalized version of these stories. And if you want to keep tracking exactly how this broader US-China technology competition continues to unfold, subscribe, because based on how quickly new developments keep emerging from both sides of this race, there is clearly a great deal more still to come. Now, here is where the story becomes even more genuinely interesting, and considerably more honest than the simple headline framing suggests, because several independent technology and policy experts interviewed following Linshine's announcement offered a meaningfully more skeptical, more carefully qualified assessment of exactly what this specific achievement actually demonstrates. Addison Snell, the chief executive of Intersect 360 Research, a firm that specifically focuses on analyzing the supercomputing industry, offered a genuinely telling reaction, and stating he was not particularly surprised that a Chinese system had reclaimed the top position, given how much sustained investment the country has poured into this specific area. What actually surprised him instead was that China chose to formally submit the system for public recognition at all, a comment that hints at something genuinely important about how these rankings work and what submitting to them actually signals strategically beyond the raw performance numbers themselves. That specific observation connects directly to perhaps the single most important nuance in this entire story, one that responsible reporting absolutely needs to include rather than glossing over in favor of the simpler, more dramatic headline. Multiple experts specifically pointed out that the top 500 ranking system itself has become considerably less representative of genuine cutting-edge computing power than it was in previous decades, precisely because of how the broader computing industry has evolved over just the past several years. The top 500 list ranks systems specifically based on their performance running a particular benchmark test originally designed to mimic traditional scientific computing workloads, things like simulating how individual atoms interact with each other or modeling complex physical phenomena. The kind of research work that national laboratories and universities have traditionally used supercomputers to perform for decades. But in more recent years, an entirely different category of massive computing infrastructure has emerged, built not by national governments or research institutions, but by private technology, companies specifically to power artificial intelligence training and inference workloads instead. Companies like Microsoft, Amazon, and Google's parent company Alphabet have all built out absolutely enormous computing clusters of their own, but these companies generally do not choose to submit their systems for consideration on the top 500 list at all, since their infrastructure is specifically optimized for a fundamentally different type of computational workload than the traditional scientific benchmark this particular ranking actually measures. That distinction matters enormously for correctly interpreting China's specific achievement here. A study published last year by a group of AI policy researchers, including Konstantin Pilz, James Sanders, Robbie Rahman, and Leonard Heim, found that xAI's Colossus system, the massive AI computing cluster built by Elon Musk's artificial intelligence company, was already likely more computationally powerful than El Capitan even before Linshine's announcement, despite Colossus never once appearing on the top 500 list at all, simply because xAI, like most major AI companies, has chosen not to formally submit its systems for that particular kind of public ranking. Jimmy Goodrich, a senior fellow at the University of California, specifically focused on this area, made the point even more bluntly, stating that if the major cloud computing hyperscalers actually did choose to submit their own systems for consideration, this so-called world's fastest supercomputer title would likely not even crack the top 5 most powerful systems currently operating anywhere on the planet. In other words, the honest, complete picture here is that China's Linshine genuinely does hold the title of fastest publicly recognized supercomputer, specifically according to one particular, increasingly outdated benchmark methodology, a genuinely real and legitimate technical achievement in its own right, but almost certainly does not represent the single most computationally powerful machine currently operating anywhere in the world when you account for the private, unranked AI-focused computing infrastructure that companies like xAI, Microsoft, and Google have quietly built in recent years, specifically for different purposes than this traditional ranking was ever designed to measure. There's also a genuinely important detail about Linshine's specific technical composition worth understanding, one that connects directly back to the broader export control story we have touched on in previous videos covering the US-China technology competition. According to details presented presented alongside the official ranking results, Linshine reportedly does not contain any of the most advanced specialized AI accelerator chips currently available, the kind of cutting-edge processors companies like NVIDIA manufacture, and that remains subject to ongoing, deliberately strict American export restrictions, specifically designed to limit China's access to that particular category of advanced computing hardware. Jimmy Goodrich offered a pointed, genuinely skeptical interpretation of that specific detail, suggesting China is essentially hoping the world focuses purely on the headline ranking itself, while overlooking the underlying technical details, specifically in order to advance a broader narrative that American export controls have become largely ineffective at actually limiting China's advanced computing capabilities. That is a genuinely fair, worthwhile point of skepticism to bring to this entire story. And it reflects exactly the kind of careful, detail-oriented analysis that separates a genuinely informed understanding of this competition from simply accepting whichever country's most recent headline achievement at face value without digging into the specific technical and strategic context underneath it. It is also worth placing Linshine's specific achievement within the fuller historical arc of Chinese supercomputing more broadly, because that longer view adds genuinely useful context to understanding exactly how significant, or how modest, this particular return to the top actually is. China has held the world's fastest supercomputer title a grand total of 3 separate times throughout the entire history of the top 500 ranking. First, with a system called Tianhe 1 back in 2010, though notably, only one of those 3 previous occasions actually involved a machine built using fully domestic Chinese-designed processors rather than components purchased or adapted from foreign, primarily American, technology. Prior to the year 2000, China had only ever fielded a total of 2 internationally recognized supercomputers throughout its entire computing history, both of which were comparatively low-end machines purchased directly from the United States. The country's supercomputing capability grew considerably over the following 2 decades, reaching what many analysts consider its peak influence and prominence around 2019, before entering a period of relative decline on this specific public ranking, driven largely by the same escalating chip export restrictions that eventually led China to stop submitting its most advanced systems for consideration entirely after 2023. Seen against that longer historical backdrop, Linshine's return to the very top of the list represents a genuinely meaningful milestone, specifically in terms of demonstrating renewed Chinese confidence in its own domestic chip design and manufacturing capability, even while the broader, more nuanced picture around AI-specific computing power, where the real cutting edge of the industry has increasingly moved in recent years, remains considerably more complicated and considerably less clearly in China's favor than the simple headline ranking alone might suggest to a casual observer. It is worth taking a moment to explore the Genesis mission a bit more deeply, specific executive orders, and understanding that connection helps clarify just how comprehensive the Trump administration's broader approach to emerging computing technology genuinely is. It gets conducted explicitly aiming to accelerate the pace of discovery across multiple fields simultaneously, quantum computing included among them. That framing matters because it reveals something genuinely important about how the current administration appears to be thinking about these emerging technologies and not as isolated separate policy priorities, each competing for attention and resources on their own, but as deeply interconnected pieces of a single, unified technological strategy, where progress in artificial intelligence directly accelerates progress in quantum computing and vice versa, a dynamic we have actually discussed in considerable detail in an earlier video specifically covering how AI-powered research agents manage to compress what would normally take human scientists months or years of work into a matter of days when analyzing quantum encryption vulnerabilities, but rather the latest, most specific installment in a broader, sustained, multi-year strategic effort spanning multiple separate executive actions, all aimed at ensuring American leadership across an interconnected web of emerging computing technologies simultaneously, rather than a single, narrow bet placed exclusively on quantum computing in isolation. It is also worth examining the specific legislative context surrounding these executive orders, because the White House did not act entirely alone here, and understanding the broader congressional context adds meaningful depth to this story. According to legal analysis published alongside coverage of these executive orders, Congress has been separately pursuing bipartisan legislation specifically aimed at reauthorizing and modernizing the original National Quantum Initiative Act, a piece of legislation first passed all the way back in 2018 during Trump's first term in office. That proposed new legislation would, among other provisions, expand federal quantum research and development programs considerably beyond their current scope, actively promote the commercialization of quantum technologies developed inside government-funded research programs, support quantum-specific workforce development initiatives of exactly the kind we discussed in a previous video covering the persistent quantum talent shortage across the broader industry, and specifically work to strengthen the security and resilience of domestic quantum supply chains. If this legislation ultimately passes Congress and becomes law, it would provide a longer-term, statutorily guaranteed funding framework specifically designed to complement and reinforce the administration's own executive actions, giving America's broader quantum computing strategy a more durable, bipartisan legal foundation that would persist regardless of which specific political party happens to control the White House in future years, rather than depending entirely on executive orders that a future administration could simply choose to reverse or deprioritize at will. There is also a meaningful, worthwhile comparison to draw here between this current round of American quantum policy and the specific funding structure we discussed in detail in a previous video covering IBM's newly announced quantum chip foundry. That earlier story involved roughly $2 billion in direct CHIPS Act funding distributed across 9 different American quantum computing companies, with IBM specifically receiving the largest individual allocation to help build dedicated large-scale domestic quantum manufacturing infrastructure. These newest executive orders build DI directly on top of that same broader policy foundation, adding an even more ambitious government-coordinated research target, energy facility by 2028, alongside a legally enforceable cybersecurity mandate, specifically requiring federal contractors to adopt quantum-resistant encryption on a fixed, binding timeline. Seen together across these 2 separate stories we have now covered on this channel, a genuinely coherent, multi-pronged American quantum strategy starts to emerge, combining direct manufacturing infrastructure investment through the CHIPS Act, ambitious government-coordinated research targets through these newest executive orders, and mandatory, enforceable cybersecurity migration requirements, specifically designed to protect government and critical infrastructure, systems against the exact quantum decryption threat we discussed at length in an even earlier video covering how AI, accelerated research, had dramatically shrunk the theoretical resource requirements needed to break modern encryption standards. It is genuinely worth pausing here to examine the specific 2028 target date for a scientifically useful quantum computer a bit more critically, because setting a specific public target date carries real political risk if that target ultimately proves too ambitious to actually meet on schedule. Energy Secretary Chris Wright's own candid remarks at the signing ceremony, acknowledging that achieving genuinely error-corrected, scientifically relevant quantum computing remains tricky, and that the country is close but not quite there yet, reflect a refreshingly honest, appropriately hedged public statement from a senior government official, rather than the kind of unconditionally confident, purely promotional language that sometimes characterizes announcements of this type. That specific honesty is worth noting and, frankly, worth appreciating, since it suggests the administration's public messaging around this ambitious 2028 target is being calibrated with at least some genuine awareness of the technical uncertainty still involved, rather than presenting an artificially inflated, guaranteed timeline purely for political or public relations purposes. Whether that specific 2028 target ultimately proves achievable will depend heavily on exactly the kind of sustained technical progress we have tracked across multiple previous videos on this channel, including error correction milestones from companies like Google and IBM, continued advances in alternative hardware approaches like the neutral atom systems we discussed in earlier videos, and the practical success of newly funded manufacturing infrastructure projects like IBM's Andorran Foundry actually coming online and beginning reliable large-scale production on schedule. Let's bring this back around to the specific timing question that gives this entire story its dramatic hook, because even after all of the careful, honest nuance we have just walked through together, there is still something genuinely worth sitting with regarding how closely these 2 separate announcements landed next to each other on the calendar. Whether or not China's supercomputing team deliberately timed their top 500 submission specifically to coincide with, or respond directly to, Trump's quantum computing executive orders remains genuinely unknown and, frankly, probably unknowable from the outside, since supercomputer rankings follow their own fixed biannual conference schedule that has nothing inherently to do with American executive order signing ceremonies. But even setting aside any question of deliberate timing or intentional messaging, the sheer fact that these 2 events landed within 48 hours of each other captures something genuinely real and important about the current state of this broader technology competition, regardless of whether the specific timing itself was coincidental or calculated. Both countries are simultaneously investing enormous, sustained resources across essentially every major category of advanced computing technology at once: classical supercomputing, artificial intelligence infrastructure, and quantum computing specifically, And news of genuine progress or genuine milestones from either side now arrives frequently enough and closely enough spaced together that these kinds of dramatic, seemingly connected coincidences are increasingly likely to keep happening again and again as this broader competition continues accelerating across the coming months and years. It is also worth connecting this specific supercomputing story back to the broader pattern of Chinese technological self-sufficiency efforts we have traced across several previous videos on this channel, because Linshine does not represent an isolated, standalone achievement happening independently of everything else China has been building. We have already discussed in detail how Chinese researchers commercially deployed neutral atom quantum computers, operating entirely without cryogenic cooling infrastructure, how Chinese photonic processors published genuinely startling benchmark comparisons against classical supercomputers in the peer-reviewed journal Nature, and how China's own domestically manufactured superconducting quantum processors, including the Zhuchangji series, have demonstrated increasingly competitive performance despite ongoing chip export restrictions. Linshine fits neatly into that exact same broader strategic pattern. Another example of Chinese engineers and researchers building genuinely capable, cutting-edge computing infrastructure using domestically designed components, specifically in response to, and in spite of, sustained American efforts to limit the country's access to the most advanced foreign semiconductor manufacturing technology. Whether you view that broader pattern as evidence that American export controls are failing to meaningfully constrain Chinese technological progress, or as evidence that those same controls are successfully forcing China to develop technologically alternative, less efficient workarounds instead of simply purchasing the most advanced available components on the open market, likely depends heavily on your own broader assessment of the underlying policy, a genuinely contested question among serious policy experts that deserves its own dedicated, careful examination beyond what we have space for in this particular video. There is also a meaningful point worth raising about how both governments, American and Chinese alike, appear to be using these kinds of high-profile, headline-generating technology announcements as tools of public diplomacy and national narrative building, separate from whatever genuine underlying scientific or engineering progress each announcement actually represents. Trump's executive orders were signed publicly, with IBM's own chief executive present at the ceremony, specifically to offer public praise, precisely the kind of visible, symbolically loaded event designed to communicate American resolve and leadership to both domestic and international audiences simultaneously. China's decision to formally submit Linshine for public Top 500 recognition, after 3 years of deliberately choosing not to submit its most advanced systems at all, similarly reads as a calculated, symbolically significant choice, one that goes beyond simply building an impressive piece of computing hardware in a private laboratory, and instead deliberately seeks public, internationally recognized validation of that specific achievement. Both of these events, in other words, function simultaneously as genuine, substantive technological milestones and as carefully choreographed pieces of national technological messaging, and a fully informed understanding of this ongoing competition requires paying close attention to both dimensions at once, the underlying engineering reality and the surrounding public narrative. Each country is actively trying to construct around that reality for domestic political and international strategic purposes alike. It is also worth considering what genuinely happens next on both sides of this story, since neither the American executive orders nor China's supercomputing achievement represents a finished, completed chapter in this ongoing competition. On the American side, the coming months will likely reveal considerably more detail about exactly how the newly established quantum computer for application development and discovery science effort actually intends to proceed, including which specific companies and research institutions get selected to help build toward that ambitious 2028 target, and how the promised advanced market commitments from the Department of Commerce actually get structured and funded in practice. On the Chinese side, it remains genuinely worth watching whether Linshine represents an isolated, deliberately timed public relations moment, or the beginning of a renewed, sustained pattern of China, once again regularly submitting its most advanced computing systems for public international recognition, after several years of comparative public silence driven by ongoing export control pressures. Given how quickly new developments have emerged from both countries across essentially every category of advanced computing technology we have covered together on this channel over the past several videos, quantum computing, classical supercomputing, and artificial intelligence infrastructure alike, it seems reasonably likely that this specific story, dramatic and neatly timed as it currently appears, will soon be followed by yet another headline, generating announcement from one side or the other, continuing the same broader accelerating pattern of competitive technological upmanship that has increasingly come to define this entire multi-front race between the world's two largest economies. So where does this actually leave us? Now that we have carefully walked through both halves of this genuinely fascinating, genuinely well-timed story. The honest, complete picture requires holding several distinct, sometimes seemingly contradictory truths together simultaneously, rather than collapsing everything down into either an alarmist story about American technological decline or a dismissive story about an insignificant, purely symbolic Chinese achievement. Trump's June 22nd executive orders represent a genuinely serious, well-resourced escalation of America's own quantum computing ambitions, backed by already doubled federal research funding, an explicit 2028 timeline for a scientific ally-useful quantum computer, and legally binding, enforceable requirements pushing federal contractors toward quantum-resistant encryption on a fixed, mandatory schedule. China's Linshine supercomputer represents a genuinely real, legitimately impressive classical computing achievement, demonstrating renewed confidence in domestic Chinese chip design capability after several years of comparative absence from public international rankings, driven specifically by a deliberate strategy of building genuine technological self, sufficiency in the face of ongoing American export restrictions. But Linshine is not a quantum computer. It does not directly answer or undermine Trump's specifically quantum-focused policy announcement in any technically meaningful sense, and according to multiple independent experts, likely does not even represent the single most powerful computing system currently operating anywhere in the world, once you account for the enormous, privately built, AI-focused computing infrastructure that companies like xAI, Microsoft, and Google have constructed but chosen not to submit for this particular kind of public ranking. What this story genuinely, accurately demonstrates is not that China humiliated America's quantum ambitions within 48 hours of their announcement, but rather that both countries are simultaneously racing forward across multiple, genuinely distinct fronts of advanced computing technology at once, each looking for opportunities to demonstrate strength and capability to the rest of the world, that the sheer pace of announcements from both sides has become fast enough that headline-grabbing coincidences like this one, dramatic as they genuinely feel in the moment, are likely to keep happening again and again as this broader multi-front technology competition continues accelerating in the months and years directly ahead. The next time a headline promises one country has definitively beaten another at some specific corner of this sprawling technology race, the honest, most useful move is exactly the one we just walked through together. Pause, separate the genuine technical achievement from the surrounding narrative, and ask specifically what was actually measured, against what specific benchmark, and what the particular measurement does and does not tell you about the much broader, much messier competition still playing out underneath every single one of these individual headlines.